You wake up, reach for your phone, and for a few seconds, everything feels normal. Messages, headlines, photos of people laughing at dinners you weren't invited to, someone announcing a new job, someone else getting married, another person packing for a country you've always wanted to visit. You scroll without thinking, yet with every swipe, something quiet begins to grow inside you. It isn't exactly jealousy. It isn't loneliness either. It's something harder to describe. It's the unsettling feeling that everyone else seems to have found their place while you're still standing outside, looking through a window. You still show up to work. You answer texts. You smile when someone asks how you've been. You sit with friends, surrounded by conversation, yet somehow feel like you're watching yourself from a distance, playing a role you've memorized, instead of living a life that actually belongs to you. And maybe the strangest part is that nothing appears to be terribly wrong. You have people around you. You have responsibilities. You have goals. Yet somewhere beneath all of it, there's a quiet question you almost never say out loud. Where do I actually belong? It's a question that doesn't arrive dramatically. It creeps into ordinary moments. During the drive home after work, while unpacking groceries, sitting in a crowded coffee shop where everyone seems connected to something invisible that somehow passed you by. If you've been carrying that feeling, you're far from alone. In fact, you may be experiencing something that has become almost impossible to avoid in the modern world. Not because there's something broken inside you, but because the world you inherited no longer offers the kinds of belonging human beings evolved to expect. That sounds like bad news. Oddly enough, it may be one of the most hopeful realizations you'll ever have. Because as historian and philosopher Yuval Noah Harari often suggests, the stories that once gave people certainty were never permanent truths. They were shared narratives. Powerful, necessary, and deeply human, but still stories. Nations, religions, companies, currencies, careers, even identities. They organized billions of strangers into functioning societies because enough people agreed to believe in them together. For thousands of years, those stories gave people an answer before they ever asked the question, who are you? You belong here. You are one of us. Your purpose has already been decided. You were born into a family, a village, a religion, a trade, a culture. There wasn't much room for confusion because there wasn't much room for choice. Your life might have been unimaginably difficult, but your identity rarely felt negotiable. Today, almost everything is negotiable. Where you live, what you believe, who you love, how many careers you'll have, whether you'll stay in the country where you were born, whether you'll even recognize yourself 10 years from now. Freedom expanded, certainty disappeared. And that's the paradox almost nobody prepares you for. We spend our childhood believing freedom will finally make us feel complete. Then adulthood arrives, and we discover that unlimited possibility often feels less like liberation, and more like standing in the middle of an endless ocean without a map. When every direction is possible, every decision quietly becomes a loss of every other life you could have lived. No wonder so many people feel untethered. Have you ever noticed that even after reaching something you've worked toward for years, the feeling doesn't last very long? You finally get the promotion, you move to a new city, you buy the apartment, you reinvent yourself. For a few weeks, maybe a few months, everything feels exciting. Then one morning, the same quiet question returns. Now what? That question isn't a personal failure. It's the sound of an old psychological system trying to operate in a world that has completely changed. For nearly all of human history, survival depended on belonging to a group. Being rejected wasn't emotionally uncomfortable. It was often fatal. Our ancestors lived in small tribes where everyone knew everyone else. Your value wasn't measured by followers or resumes. It was woven into everyday life. Someone hunted. Someone gathered plants. Someone cared for children. Someone remembered stories. Someone watched the stars. You mattered because your absence mattered. If you disappeared, people noticed. Your brain evolved inside those intimate circles. It learned to associate connection with safety, isolation with danger, acceptance with survival. Thousands of generations shaped a nervous system that still lives inside you today. But look around. How many people truly know you? Not your profile, not your achievements, not your carefully edited personality you. The version of you that exists when no one is watching. The strange thing is that we're connected to more human beings than any generation before us, yet many people have never felt more psychologically homeless. We're constantly visible but rarely seen. Constantly communicating but rarely understood. Constantly informed but increasingly uncertain about who we are. The modern world solved many ancient problems. It also created entirely new ones. There was a time when identity was inherited. Now it's assembled, piece by piece, vary by preference, playlist by playlist, political opinion, career title, fitness routine, fashion, travel, productivity. personal brand, without realizing it. Many of us spend years constructing ourselves the way companies build advertisements, hoping that if we find the right combination of interests and accomplishments, the feeling of belonging will finally arrive. But identity doesn't behave like a shopping cart. You can't keep adding pieces forever and expect emptiness to disappear. Sometimes the emptiness grows precisely because you've become exhausted from performing someone you're not entirely sure you ever chose to become. That realization can be terrifying. It can also become the beginning of something honest. History has seen moments like this before, although rarely on such a global scale. When ancient empires collapsed, millions of people suddenly lost the structures that had defined reality for generations. The citizens of Rome didn't simply lose roads or armies. They lost certainty. The world they assumed would always exist slowly dissolved beneath their feet. Centuries later, entire societies experienced similar shocks during the Industrial Revolution. Families left villages where their ancestors had lived for hundreds of years and moved into growing cities filled with strangers. Old traditions weakened, new identities emerged. People gained opportunities their grandparents couldn't imagine. They also experienced unprecedented anxiety about where they fit. Every great transformation in history has created the same emotional echo. The old story stops making sense before the new one has fully arrived. That space between stories is deeply uncomfortable. It's where confusion lives. It's where grief hides. It's also where genuine freedom quietly begins. Because when inherited identities lose their grip, something extraordinary becomes possible. For the first time, you aren't simply asking, who am I supposed to be? You're asking, who am I beneath all the stories I've been handed? Most people spend years avoiding that question, not because they're weak, because it's frightening. It's much easier to inherit a script than to write one. Have you ever caught yourself changing slightly depending on who's around? Around coworkers, you're one version of yourself. Around family, another. With old friends, another again. Online, perhaps someone entirely different. None of these versions are necessarily fake. But after enough years of shifting between them, something subtle happens. You begin wondering whether there's an original version underneath them all, or whether you've become nothing more than a collection of performances. Psychologists sometimes describe identity as something fluid rather than fixed. Not a statue carved from stone, but a river, constantly reshaped by experience. That sounds comforting until you actually live through it, because rivers don't always know where they're going. They simply keep moving. Perhaps that's why periods of transition feel so emotionally disorienting, graduating, changing careers, ending relationships, moving across the country, losing faith, becoming a parent, watching your children leave home. Each moment quietly removes an old identity before the new one has fully formed. The uncomfortable emptiness in between often gets mistaken for failure. But what if it isn't? What if feeling like you no longer belong isn't evidence that you've lost yourself? What if it's evidence that you've finally outgrown a story that was never big enough to contain the person you're becoming? That possibility changes everything, because suddenly, the feeling you've been trying so desperately to escape begins to look different. Less like exile, more like awakening. Harari often reminds us that humans possess an extraordinary ability unlike any other species. We don't simply survive inside reality. We cooperate through shared imagination. Entire civilizations exist because billions of people agree to believe in invisible systems together. Money has value because we collectively trust it. Borders exist because enough people recognize them. Institutions endure because generations keep telling the same stories. Those shared stories built the modern world. But they also leave every individual with a question that no civilization can answer on their behalf. Once the inherited story no longer feels like home, where do you go next? The answer isn't waiting in another job title, another city, another perfectly curated version of yourself. It begins somewhere far quieter. And to understand why, we have to look much deeper, not only into history, but into the architecture of the human mind itself, where the need to belong first took shape long before civilization ever learned to give it a name. The human mind has a remarkable talent for turning uncertainty into a personal flaw. The moment life begins to feel unfamiliar, it quietly whispers, "Something must be wrong with me." It almost never considers another possibility. Maybe nothing is wrong with you. Maybe you're standing at the edge of an old identity that can no longer carry the weight of who you've become. There's a reason that moments of transformation often feel indistinguishable from moments of loss. Your brain doesn't experience change as an abstract concept. It experiences it as the disappearance of something that once kept you safe. Even when the old version of yourself wasn't making you happy, it was familiar. And familiarity has always been one of the nervous system's favorite hiding places. Neuroscientists have found that the brain is constantly trying to predict what's about to happen. It builds internal maps of reality, so you don't have to consciously analyze every sound, every face, every decision. These mental shortcuts are incredibly efficient. Without them, ordinary life would become overwhelming. But they come with an unexpected consequence. The brain doesn't simply crave pleasure, it craves predictability. That's why people sometimes remain in careers they secretly hate, relationships that slowly drain them, or identities they've long outgrown. Not because suffering feels good, but because uncertainty feels dangerous. Your nervous system often prefers a familiar prison over an unfamiliar freedom. And that's where the feeling of not belonging becomes so confusing. Part of you wants change. Another part desperately wants the comfort of what you've already known. You find yourself caught between two versions of your own future, unable to fully return, yet terrified to move forward. If that sounds familiar, consider this. The discomfort you're feeling may not be a signal that you're lost. It may be evidence that your internal map no longer matches the territory. The psychologists sometimes call this cognitive dissonance, the tension that appears when our beliefs, actions, or identities stop aligning with our lived experience. It's uncomfortable because the mind naturally seeks coherence. We want the story of our lives to make sense. But what happens when the story you've been telling yourself for years suddenly stops feeling true? What happens when the career you once dreamed of becomes emotionally empty? When the city you've always called home begins to feel foreign? When the values you inherited no longer survive your own curiosity? Most people don't recognize these moments as invitations. They experience them as failures. They tell themselves they should be more grateful, more disciplined, more positive. They work harder to preserve an identity that's already collapsing from within. Yet every attempt to force certainty only deepens the quiet exhaustion they can't explain. Carl Jung spent much of his life exploring exactly this tension. He believed that every person carries two lives, the one the world rewards, and the one the soul quietly asks for. The first life is built from expectations, family expectations, cultural expectations, professional expectations. It teaches you how to become acceptable. The second life begins much later, usually after something falls apart, a relationship ends, a parent dies. A dream quietly dissolves, success finally arrives, and somehow changes nothing. Those moments force an uncomfortable realization. You've spent years becoming someone, but was it ever truly you? Jung called the social mask we wear the persona. It's not inherently dishonest. In many ways it's necessary. Every society requires us to adapt. We learn manners, professionalism, emotional restraint. We become different versions of ourselves depending on the room we're standing in. The problem begins when the mask slowly replaces the face beneath it. When you've worn it for so many years that removing it feels impossible. Have you ever had someone tell you they miss the old you? It's a strange sentence. Sometimes it's spoken with love. Sometimes with disappointment. But hidden inside it is an assumption that people are supposed to remain psychologically recognizable forever. Yet that's never how human beings have actually worked. The child you once were no longer exists. The teenager who feared fitting in has disappeared too. Even the version of yourself from 5 years ago would probably recognize things in your life that now seem completely ordinary. Identity has always been changing. What's different today is the speed. Technology doesn't merely change the world around us. It accelerates the rate at which we reinvent ourselves. Every few years, entire industries appear and disappear. Algorithms decide what deserves your attention. Artificial intelligence begins performing tasks that once defined entire careers. Social media rewards constant reinvention while quietly punishing authenticity that doesn't fit current trends. For the first time in history, millions of people wake up every morning inside environments specifically designed to capture and reshape their attention. Attention, not time, not money, attention. Because whoever shapes your attention eventually begins shaping your identity. Think about how often your thoughts are interrupted before they've fully formed. You reach for your phone to check the weather, 20 minutes disappear. You open one video, it becomes 15. You begin reading one article. An endless stream of recommendations quietly pulls your mind somewhere else. Nothing dramatic happens. No one forces you. Yet by the end of the day, your inner world feels strangely crowded. Not with your own thoughts, with everyone else's. Harari has repeatedly warned that data may become more valuable than human self-understanding. The danger isn't simply that companies know what you'll buy. It's that algorithms may begin predicting your behavior before you understand your own motivations. If an algorithm consistently knows what captures your emotions, influences your decisions, and holds your attention longer than you know yourself, then one profound question emerges. Who is actually writing the story of your life? That question becomes even more unsettling when you realize how often modern identity is built through comparison. You no longer compare yourself with your neighbors. You compare yourself with millions, every day. The happiest moments, the strongest bodies, the most successful entrepreneurs, the most beautiful homes, the most extraordinary vacations. Your brain was never designed for this scale of social comparison. For most of human history, the people you compared yourself with lived within walking distance. Now they're everywhere, and they never stop performing. No wonder so many people quietly conclude they're falling behind. But behind whom? A carefully edited collection of moments? A digital performance? A life that may itself be driven by the exact same insecurity? The irony is almost heartbreaking. Millions of people desperately trying to convince one another that they belong, while secretly wondering if anyone truly does. Perhaps that's why loneliness has become one of the defining emotional experiences of modern civilization. Not because we're physically alone, but because we've confused visibility with intimacy. Someone can know what you ate for breakfast every morning and still have no idea what keeps you awake at night. Someone can like every photo you post without ever seeing the fear you've learned to hide behind your smile. Connection has become abundant. Recognition has become rare. And somewhere beneath all of this lies another ancient psychological truth. Human beings don't only seek acceptance. We seek meaning. Viktor Frankl observed this after surviving some of history's darkest experiences. He noticed that people could endure extraordinary suffering if they believed it served a purpose. Meaning didn't erase pain. It transformed it. The opposite was equally revealing. A comfortable life without meaning often produced a quieter kind of despair, one that couldn't easily be explained. This may be why so many people feel restless despite living in the safest and most prosperous societies humanity has ever created. Our ancestors worried about surviving the winter. We often worry about surviving our own thoughts. The external dangers became smaller. The internal questions became louder. Who am I? What matters? Where do I belong? Those questions cannot be answered by another purchase, another promotion, another 1,000 followers, because they're not problems of achievement. They're questions of consciousness. Buddhist philosophy has wrestled with this paradox for thousands of years. It suggests that much of human suffering comes from clinging to identities, possessions, expectations, and even the illusion of a permanent self. At first, that idea sounds unsettling. If there is no fixed self, then what exactly are we protecting? But perhaps that's the wrong question. Maybe the more liberating one is this. What if you don't need to defend an identity that's constantly changing? What if your deepest self isn't the collection of labels you've accumulated, but the awareness quietly observing them all? Notice what happens whenever you say, I am my job, I am successful, I am a failure, I am the smart one, I am the quiet one. Each label feels stable for a while, then life changes, the job disappears, sex fades, relationships end, health shifts, and suddenly, if your identity was built entirely on those labels, it collapses alongside them. Perhaps that explains why losing a role in life often feels like losing yourself. But maybe the self was never the role to begin with. Nietzsche once suggested that becoming who you are requires first dismantling who you've been told to be. It's a painful process because every layer removed feels like a small death. Yet every unnecessary identity surrendered creates space for something more honest to emerge, not something invented, something uncovered. Maybe that's why periods of not belonging often arrive before periods of profound clarity. Before you discover where you truly fit, life quietly removes every place where you no longer do. It's an experience that feels cruel while it's happening. Only later does it begin to resemble mercy. So when was the last time you allowed yourself to sit with that uncomfortable space instead of rushing to fill it? Not with another distraction. Not with another achievement. Not with another version of yourself designed to earn approval. Just silence. Long enough to hear the questions underneath the noise. Because the answers you've been searching for may never arrive through louder opinions or faster lives. They often emerge in the rare moments when the world finally stops telling you who to become, and you begin noticing the quiet voice that has been waiting beneath it all. That quiet voice is easy to miss because it doesn't compete for your attention. It doesn't arrive as certainty. It doesn't announce itself with dramatic revelations. Most of the time, it speaks through subtle moments that almost seem insignificant. A conversation that lingers in your mind long after it ends. A book that makes you feel strangely exposed. A walk where, for the first time in months, you notice the sound of the wind instead of the noise inside your head. For a few brief seconds, you aren't trying to become anyone. You're simply present. And perhaps that is where belonging begins. Not as a place you find, but as a relationship you rebuild with your own awareness. Modern culture rarely encourages that relationship. It teaches us to optimize everything, except our capacity to simply observe ourselves. We measure productivity, income, followers, and accomplishments. We track our sleep, our calories, our investments, our careers. Yet almost no one asks the question that quietly determines the quality of every other answer. What is directing my attention? Because attention is where your life actually happens. Not in your plans, not in your memories, not in the person you hope to become someday. Only here, only now. Harari has often argued that the greatest struggle of the 21st century may not be between nations or ideologies, but between human awareness and the countless systems competing to control it. That sounds like a technological problem. It isn't. It's a deeply personal one. Every day, invisible forces are asking you to become someone. Consume this, believe this, fear this, desire this, compare yourself to this. Outrage yourself over this, repeat tomorrow. After enough repetition, those voices begin to sound like your own. Until one day, you can't remember where your authentic thoughts end and borrowed opinions begin. Maybe that's why so many people describe feeling emotionally exhausted, without understanding why. They're carrying thousands of expectations that were never consciously chosen. Some came from childhood, some came from culture, some arrived through social media. Others slipped quietly into their lives through years of comparison. Each one added another invisible layer between themselves and the person they might have become. The strange thing is that freedom isn't always about adding more choices. Sometimes it's about seeing which choices were never truly yours. Marcus Aurelius understood something remarkably similar nearly 2,000 years ago. He ruled one of the largest empires in history, surrounded by unimaginable wealth and influence. Yet the greatest battles recorded in his private writings were not against foreign armies. They were against his own mind. Again and again, he reminded himself that peace depends less on controlling the world than on recognizing which parts of it were never within his control. It's an ancient insight that feels surprisingly modern. You cannot control whether everyone understands you. You cannot control whether society rewards authenticity. You cannot control whether old friends recognize the person you're becoming. You cannot even control whether your carefully constructed identity survives the next decade. History suggests it probably won't. But you can become aware of how tightly you're holding on to identities that no longer fit. You can notice how much energy goes into proving yourself. You can ask whether your ambitions belong to your own heart or to someone else's expectations. These aren't comfortable questions. They rarely produce immediate answers, but they create something far more valuable: honesty. And honesty has an unusual effect on the human spirit. At first, it feels like standing alone. Then, almost without warning, it becomes the first place that actually feels like home. Because belonging was never meant to begin with everyone else. It begins when you stop abandoning yourself in order to be accepted. Think back to the moments in your life when you felt most alive. Not necessarily happiest, alive. Maybe it happened while creating something no one else understood. Maybe during a difficult conversation where, for the first time, you spoke honestly instead of saying what people expected. Maybe while traveling somewhere unfamiliar, where none of your usual labels seem to matter. Those experiences often share one hidden quality. For a little while, you stopped performing. You simply existed. Children understand this naturally. Watch a young child become fascinated by a puddle after the rain. They aren't thinking about productivity.fedaj. They aren't worried about whether fascination is impressive. They're simply responding to reality as it unfolds. Somewhere along the way, many adults lose that ability. We become experts at managing impressions while forgetting how to experience the present. We learn how to build successful lives, not always meaningful ones. Perhaps that is why so many people secretly fantasize about starting over. Moving somewhere no one knows their name, changing careers, deleting every social media account, beginning again. It's rarely the location they're longing for. It's the possibility of existing without the weight of accumulated expectations. Have you ever wondered why those fantasies feel so emotionally powerful? Because they reveal something important. Deep down, part of you already knows that your identity is far more flexible than you've been led to believe. The person you think you have to be is often just the person you've practiced being the longest. And habits, even psychological ones, can change. This doesn't mean abandoning responsibility or rejecting every role in your life. You will still be a parent, a partner, a friend, a coworker. You'll still participate in society. The difference is subtle but profound. Instead of treating those roles as your identity, you begin seeing them as expressions of it. A role can change, the awareness behind it remains. This shift transforms failure. When your identity is fused with achievement, every setback feels like evidence that you are inadequate. When your identity becomes rooted in awareness rather than performance, failure becomes information instead of condemnation. You become curious instead of ashamed, flexible instead of fragile, open instead of defensive. Psychologists have long observed that resilience isn't the absence of pain. It's the ability to adapt without losing your essential capacity to remain present. In other words, resilience grows strongest in people who stop demanding certainty from life. That may be one of the hardest lessons adulthood ever teaches. There is no final version of you waiting at the end of the journey. No permanent arrival. No moment where confusion disappears forever. Life keeps changing because you keep changing. The question isn't whether you'll experience uncertainty again. You will. The question is whether you'll mistake uncertainty for failure, or recognize it as evidence that you're still alive enough to grow. Maybe that's what Harari's perspective ultimately points toward. Human history has always been a history of changing stories. Empires rise. Civilizations fall. Religions evolve. Technologies reshape societies. Economic systems transform. The stories humanity tells itself never remain fixed. Why should your personal story be any different? Perhaps feeling like you no longer belong isn't a sign that your life is falling apart. Perhaps it's the moment you stop forcing yourself into stories that no longer reflect who you've become. And maybe that explains why so many of the people we admire most spent long periods feeling like outsiders. Artists who challenged convention. Scientists whose discoveries contradicted accepted wisdom. Philosophers who questioned the beliefs of their own age. They often experience isolation before they experience recognitions. Not because they wanted to be different, because growth quietly separated them from identities that could no longer contain them. You don't have to become famous to experience the same process. Every human life eventually reaches crossroads, where belonging to yesterday means betraying tomorrow. Those moments demand courage that no one else can give you. Not dramatic courage. Quiet courage, the courage to disappoint expectations, the courage to change your mind, the courage to admit that success without meaning is still a form of emptiness. The courage to sit with uncertainty long enough for something genuine to emerge. I'm curious about something. Have you ever gone through a season where you felt like you no longer belonged, only to realize later that it was actually the beginning of a completely different chapter in your life? If that resonates with you, share your experience in the comments. Someone reading your words might be in that exact place today, wondering if they're the only one who feels disconnected from everything they once called home. Sometimes a stranger's honesty becomes the reassurance another person has been searching for. And perhaps that's one of the beautiful ironies of belonging. We often find it not by pretending to have all the answers, but by admitting the questions we're carrying. Maybe the community you've been searching for isn't built around people who have perfect lives. Maybe it's built around people who are willing to face reality together. People who understand that certainty is overrated, that curiosity is stronger than fear, that awareness matters more than appearances. That being fully human has always involved moments of standing between the life that's ending and the one that hasn't yet revealed itself. So if today you feel like you no longer belong anywhere, don't rush to silence that feeling. Listen to it. It may not be telling you that you failed. It may be telling you that an old story has reached its final page. Every meaningful transformation begins with the unsettling realization that the map you've relied